At 13, I was dropped off with one suitcase and no explanation. My parents didn't hug me or promise to come back. They just left me on my wealthy Uncle Hale's front step in Connecticut and drove away. I didn't know then that this moment would shape my whole life, or that 15 years later, I would be the one holding the truth that could destroy everything he built. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Lyra, and that night, my childhood ended. Uncle Hale gave me a room, clothes, and a good school, but love was missing. Everything felt cold and controlled. His wife barely spoke to me, and I was always reminded that I was lucky to be there. Hale often said he had saved me, like I owed him my life. I learned to stay quiet and grateful, even when it hurt. Years later, I found out the truth by accident. My parents hadn't just left me. Hale helped them disappear and paid them to walk away from their responsibility. I wasn't rescued. I was traded. That secret stayed with me for years, burning inside me while I worked hard and built my own future. When I was older, I discovered that Hale's success was built on lies and illegal deals. This time, I didn't stay silent. I collected proof and let the truth come out on its own. Hale lost everything he cared about, his business, his power, his pride. I didn't feel happy watching him fall. I felt free. He took my childhood, but he didn't get to take my future. I finally walked away with my dignity, knowing I survived and became stronger than he ever expected. Living under Uncle Hale's roof felt like being locked inside a beautiful box. The house was spotless, quiet, and too perfect, like no one was meant to relax there. Every step echoed through the halls, and I learned quickly to walk softly. There were rules for everything: when to eat, where to sit, how to speak, and when to stay silent. Nothing was ever explained. I was just expected to know. I was given a large bedroom with expensive furniture and clean white walls, but it never felt like mine. I wasn't allowed to change anything. Even the bedspread stayed the same all year. At school, I wore nice clothes and attended classes most kids could only dream of, yet I felt poorer than everyone else. Other students talked about family dinners and weekend plans. I stayed quiet because I had nothing to share. Marin looked at me like I was something left behind by mistake. She never yelled or complained. Instead, she sighed whenever I entered a room, as if my presence added weight to her day. If I tried to help, she corrected me. If I stayed out of the way, she acted relieved. I learned not to ask for anything. Cade was worse. He reminded me daily that this wasn't my real home. He mocked the way I talked, the way I dressed, even the way I laughed. He told me I should be thankful for scraps. At dinner, he spoke over me, and no one stopped him. Hale watched, saying nothing, like this was some kind of lesson I needed. I smiled when expected and said thank you out of habit. Inside, I felt small and unwanted. That house gave me comfort but no safety. It gave me structure but no care. I was surrounded by wealth, yet completely alone, learning early how to survive without being seen. Hale had a favorite phrase, and he used it whenever I hesitated or questioned anything. He said he pulled me out of a bad situation, that without him I would have been lost. The way he spoke made it sound heroic, but his eyes were always sharp, like he was keeping score. Nothing he provided ever felt like a gift. It felt like a reminder. At dinner, he would comment on the cost of food. When school letters arrived, he mentioned tuition. If I needed medical care, he spoke about fees before asking how I felt. These comments weren't angry. They were calm, measured, and constant. Over time, I understood what he wanted. I was supposed to carry the weight of what I cost him. Whenever relatives visited, he told my story for me. He explained how he stepped in when no one else would. People praised his generosity, and I nodded politely, even though my chest tightened each time. Saying thank you became automatic, like breathing. I thanked him even when I hadn't asked for anything. I learned quickly that questioning rules led to lectures. Wanting privacy meant I was ungrateful. Expressing sadness was seen as disrespect. Approval came only when I followed directions exactly. I watched my tone, my posture, my words. I learned how to disappear in plain sight. Affection was rare and always conditional. A kind word followed good behavior. Silence followed mistakes. I stopped expecting comfort and focused on avoiding disappointment. Love wasn't something freely given in that house. It was something earned, measured, and easily taken away. At night, I lay awake counting the invisible balance I was building. I wondered how much I owed and if it would ever be enough. I didn't choose this arrangement, but I was trapped inside it. Hale never said the word debt, yet it hung over every interaction. I realized I wasn't there to be cared for. I was there to repay something I never agreed to owe. When I was 17, I wasn't trying to listen. I was walking past the study late at night when raised voices stopped me cold. The door wasn't fully shut, and what I heard froze my body in place. Marin sounded upset, sharp with disbelief. Hale answered her in a low, controlled tone, the kind he used when he thought no one else could hear. He spoke about an arrangement made years earlier. He said my birth parents had planned their exit carefully and wanted no ties left behind. Lawyers were involved. Documents were signed. He explained that he handled the process so everything would be clean, final, and unquestionable. The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. Marin asked why money had been transferred back then. Hale didn't hesitate. He said it was necessary to make sure there were no future claims, no surprise returns, no emotional complications. He said it was easier that way. Efficient. Permanent. My name was mentioned only once, spoken like an item on a list. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. My heart was racing so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I understood then that what I'd believed for years was a lie. No one had stepped in out of concern. I hadn't been protected. I had been removed. The hallway felt endless as I backed away. My legs shook carrying me to my room. I sat on the floor for hours, staring at nothing, replaying every sentence. Moments from my past suddenly made sense, the distance, the control, the constant reminders. That night took something from me. Trust didn't crack, it shattered. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Something quieter happened instead. I stopped hoping. I stopped expecting fairness. I realized I was alone in a way I hadn't understood before. From that moment on, I saw Hale clearly. Not as a guardian, not as a provider, but as someone who decided my fate without ever asking. After that night, I chose stillness. Speaking up would have changed nothing, and I understood that quickly. I kept my head down and followed expectations without resistance. My days became predictable. Wake early, complete assignments, return home, respond politely. No cracks showed on the surface. Meals continued as usual. I answered questions when spoken to and kept my opinions hidden. Expressions were carefully controlled. A pleasant face made life easier. Any reaction beyond that invited attention I couldn't afford. I learned how to perform normalcy until it became second nature. Education became my shield. I focused deeply, not because anyone demanded excellence, but because it gave me purpose. Numbers made sense. Systems followed logic. Policies revealed patterns. I listened closely when discussions about finances or legal matters happened nearby. Even when I wasn't addressed, I absorbed everything. Knowledge felt like something no one could take away. Inside, I changed. The softness I once had slowly disappeared. In its place grew patience and restraint. I stopped wanting approval. I stopped wishing for affection. Those desires felt dangerous. Dependence was a weakness I refused to carry forward. I began setting private rules for myself. Never ask for favors. Never show need. Never trust words without proof. I planned quietly, measuring time instead of emotions. Each year completed felt like one step closer to freedom. The lessons I gained weren't offered kindly, but they were clear. Authority shapes outcomes. Paperwork defines reality. Control belongs to those who understand the structure beneath promises. I watched how decisions were made and who benefited from them. I noticed how influence worked without raising a voice. By the time graduation approached, my path was already chosen. I wouldn't escape dramatically or confront anyone. I would leave prepared. Whatever skills I gained there would be mine alone. I would move forward without asking permission, carrying only what strengthened me. Silence kept me safe. Observation made me ready. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was preparing. The turning point came shortly after I turned 18. Hale called me into his office and slid a stack of documents across the desk. He explained them slowly, confidently, like the outcome was already decided. My name was meant to be bound to future obligations, commitments that would keep me connected and controlled. I understood enough to know what agreeing would cost me. I said no. The room went quiet in a way that felt dangerous. Hale didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned back and looked at me like I had disappointed him beyond repair. He told me that choices had consequences. Support ended immediately. Access vanished. Anything I might have expected for adulthood was gone in a single moment. I packed that same day. 2 worn bags held everything I owned. No savings. No safety net. No goodbye from Marin. Kate watched with a satisfied expression as I walked past him. Hale stood near the door and delivered his final words, telling me I should remember who kept me afloat all those years. His tone carried a threat disguised as advice. I stepped outside without responding. The air felt different, heavier, and clearer at the same time. Fear hit hard once I reached the street, but I kept moving. Every step away from that house felt unreal. I didn't know where I would sleep that night or how I would manage the weeks ahead. All I knew was that staying would have cost me myself. There was no dramatic exit. No confrontation. Just distance growing behind me. I didn't turn around. I refused to give him that satisfaction. But memory isn't something you can leave on a curb. What he said followed me for years, not as guilt, but as fuel. I carried it through uncertainty, exhaustion, and loneliness. I built my future without assistance, learning fast and falling hard. Nothing was handed to me again. I left empty-handed, but not defeated. What I took couldn't be seen or claimed back. I carried clarity, resolve, and a record of everything done to me. I moved forward quietly, knowing that some doors close so others can eventually fall. My 20s were rough and exhausting. Nothing came easily, and every step forward required effort. I lived in small rented places where the heat barely worked and the walls were thin. Sleep was short, and rest felt like a luxury. I worked whatever shifts I could find, often switching positions just to keep income steady. Each paycheck disappeared quickly, leaving little room to breathe. Learning became my way out. I enrolled in evening courses, sitting in classrooms after long workdays, forcing my mind to stay alert. Subjects tied to financial systems caught my attention. Rules, regulations, oversight, these areas revealed how organizations truly functioned. I realized mistakes and abuses always left traces if someone knew where to look. I became methodical. Every hardship pushed me to sharpen my discipline. I stopped seeing struggle as misfortune and started viewing it as training. Patterns emerged the more I studied. Certain behaviors repeated across industries. Loopholes existed everywhere, often hidden behind complexity. I learned how wrongdoing hides inside paperwork and procedures. There was no time for distraction. While others built social lives, I focused on progress. I tracked expenses carefully, avoided unnecessary risks, and planned several steps ahead. Fear didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling me. I learned how to endure pressure without breaking. Eventually, opportunities followed preparation. Short-term contracts turned into longer assignments. People noticed my attention to detail and my refusal to overlook inconsistencies. I didn't advertise my background or explain my motivation. Results spoke instead. Pain had shaped my direction, but it didn't define me anymore. What once felt like survival mode evolved into something deliberate. Each choice became calculated. Each move served a purpose. I wasn't just trying to get by, I was building capability. By the end of that decade, I wasn't wealthy or comfortable, but I was skilled and self-reliant. I understood systems from the inside out. I knew how authority could be abused and how evidence could expose it. What began as endurance slowly transformed into strategy, and for the first time, I felt prepared for whatever came next. When I was 27, I was assigned a routine review task through my work. It seemed ordinary at first, just another company structure to examine. As I scanned through records, something unfamiliar felt strangely recognizable. Certain business names stood out, not because I remembered them clearly, but because they triggered a deep sense of unease I couldn't explain. I paused and went back over the information more carefully. Ownership paths twisted through layers of entities designed to confuse outsiders. Still, the pattern felt intentional. With growing tension, I followed the trail further, checking registrations, dates, and linked accounts. That was when a connection surfaced that made my hands shake. Those entities connected directly to Hale's operations. I told myself to stay professional. Personal history had no place in analysis. Yet the more I uncovered, the harder it became to separate the two. Irregular transfers appeared across multiple years. Documents showed approvals that didn't align with timelines. Names were misspelled. Numbers didn't match. Nothing added up cleanly. Then I saw it. Several holdings were placed under my identity during my early teens. Authorization records included signatures I had never written. Legal forms claimed consent that never existed. Assets were quietly shifted into my name long before I understood what any of it meant. Responsibility without awareness. Risk without choice. The realization hit harder than anything before. This wasn't neglect or manipulation alone. This was exploitation. Just controlled my circumstances, he had used my existence as cover. My silence as protection. I didn't rush. I documented everything. Cross-references, timelines, comparisons. Each discovery confirmed the scope of what had been hidden. This wasn't a single mistake. It was a long-running operation built on deception. What hurt most wasn't the scale of the wrongdoing. It was understanding that even after I left, I was still being used. My name carried weight without my permission. My past was still serving his interests. That moment reshaped everything. What I once thought ended had only been paused. And now that I saw the full picture, I knew I couldn't unsee it, or ignore what came next. The discovery left me standing at a crossroads I never expected to face. I had enough knowledge to step aside and protect myself, to let distance remain between past and present. That option promised quiet and safety. No exposure. No confrontation. Just a clean break at last. But another path waited. What had been taken from me wasn't limited to documents or property. Years of control, silence, and misuse had shaped my life without consent. Walking away would mean accepting that loss as permanent. I understood then that avoidance would keep me safe, but it would never make me whole. I chose precision. Every move afterward was deliberate. I slowed down instead of reacting. I reviewed materials carefully, checking sources, dates, and authorization trails. I followed procedures exactly as written. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Emotion stayed out of reach while accuracy guided each step. Time worked in my favor. With patience, inconsistencies grew clearer. Transactions revealed intent. Layers meant to confuse began aligning into a pattern that could be explained, proven, and verified. Each verified detail strengthened the foundation beneath my case. I kept my work contained. No discussions. No outside opinions. I understood how easily information could be dismissed if handled carelessly. Everything needed to stand on its own merit. Facts had to speak louder than history. There were moments when anger surfaced, sharp and tempting. I resisted it. Rage creates mistakes. I couldn't afford errors. I reminded myself constantly that this wasn't about retaliation. It was about reclaiming authorship over my life. As the record grew, so did my clarity. I saw how power had been protected and how accountability had been avoided. I also saw where that protection ended. Systems built on deception depend on silence. Once exposed correctly, they collapse under their own weight. I didn't rush toward resolution. I let readiness decide the timing. When everything aligned, there would be no doubt, no confusion, no escape routes left behind. The choice had been made quietly, without ceremony. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was restoring balance. What came next wouldn't be loud, but it would be final. At 28, I walked into a room filled with polished shoes, tailored suits, and polite conversation. The air smelled of perfume and cologne, mingled with polished wood and subtle floral arrangements. I wasn't here as a guest. I was here with purpose, moving through the crowd with quiet confidence, every step deliberate. Hale was near the center, shaking hands and nodding to compliments, his posture rigid with pride. For a moment, his eyes didn't register me. Then recognition flickered. A polite, calculating smile spread across his face, the kind reserved for someone he thought had come crawling back. I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. I didn't speak a word. Instead, I approached the team surrounding him, men and women in suits, attentive and alert. My hands held a file, neat and heavy with evidence. I placed it in front of them, keeping my gaze steady. There was no flourish, no drama. Just facts, timelines, and proof. The weight of it was undeniable. The quiet authority in my tone demanded attention, though I barely spoke. Hale's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He opened his mouth, as if to assert control, but the pause in his expression showed he realized the situation had shifted. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one steering the room. Others began reading, flipping pages, checking details, exchanging subtle nods. Every second reinforced the gravity of what he hadn't expected. I stayed calm. I didn't gloat, I didn't rush. I merely stood, composed and assured, letting the evidence speak. Those who had admired Hale moments ago now glanced at him differently, sensing the shift. The room no longer revolved around his presence, it revolved around truth, and I had delivered it quietly, deliberately, without a word wasted. Hale's posture stiffened. His reputation, carefully built over decades, wavered under scrutiny. I remained composed, my role clear, the observer who had returned, not for mercy, but to ensure accountability. The shift happened quietly, then all at once. Reviews were initiated, and oversight tightened around every branch tied to Hale's operations. Transactions stalled. Access became restricted. Long-standing arrangements unraveled under scrutiny. One by one, those who once stood beside him stepped away, choosing distance over loyalty. The network he relied on began collapsing from the inside. Messages started coming through channels I hadn't used in years. At first, they were formal and cautious, framed as misunderstandings needing clarification. Then the tone changed. Promises surfaced. Regret appeared in carefully chosen language. He spoke about mistakes, about intentions, about how things had gone too far. Each attempt carried an offer: financial security, reconciliation, belonging. I ignored them all. There was nothing left to discuss. Any conversation would have given him leverage, a chance to reshape the narrative. Silence was the strongest boundary I could maintain. I understood now that engagement would only slow the process already in motion. Pressure increased as inquiries expanded. Restrictions multiplied. Long-hidden practices were exposed through documentation alone. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no final argument. Just procedure unfolding exactly as intended. The same mechanisms he once relied on for protection now worked against him. People who once praised his leadership avoided mention of his name. Invitations stopped. Support evaporated. Influence dissolved into isolation. The authority he wielded for years no longer answered to him. Control slipped through his fingers without a single door slammed. I watched from a distance, detached and steady. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. This outcome wasn't driven by emotion. It was the natural result of sustained misuse meeting accountability. I didn't intervene or interfere. I trusted the framework to do its job. What surprised me most wasn't the speed of his decline, but how fragile it all was once examined closely. Power built without integrity can't withstand light for long. I never responded to his pleas. Closure didn't require dialogue. Justice didn't need my voice. I had already spoken through action, and that was enough. When everything fell apart, the fallout reached beyond Hale. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had opinions, judgment, and accusations ready. They said I should have remained obedient, accepted the life I was given, and kept silent to preserve family honor. Their voices carried entitlement, as if loyalty could erase betrayal. For the first time, I didn't soften my words. I didn't couch explanations in excuses or apologies. I spoke plainly, recounting what had really happened, the arrangements made without my consent, the years of manipulation, the moments I had been silenced. I laid out the choices taken from me and the ways my identity had been used against me. I let the truth stand on its own, without pleading for understanding or forgiveness. Some faces hardened immediately. Others recoiled in disbelief. A few could not bear the confrontation and simply walked away, choosing distance rather than reckoning. I didn't follow. I didn't try to convince them. Their departure was a relief, not a loss. For the first time, I understood that blood alone doesn't guarantee care or comprehension. Family isn't a shield from accountability. Saying the words aloud freed something I hadn't realized I was holding in. Years of quiet endurance, careful observation, and hidden strategy found closure and acknowledgement. I no longer carried the burden of silent compliance or hidden pain. Speaking the truth was my reclamation, a final act separating my reality from the story others wanted to tell. I felt a strange calm. Without pretense or expectation, I could see clearly who remained and who had chosen distance. There was no bitterness toward those who left, only recognition. Their choices reflected their values, not mine. For the first time in my adult life, I was fully responsible for my narrative, and no one could take it from me. The truth had weight, and it finally rested where it belonged, squarely in my hands. At 28, I stepped into a life I had built entirely on my own terms. There were no favors, no inherited advantages, no obligations to anyone who had ever tried to define me. Stability wasn't handed to me. I earned it, piece by piece, through diligence, careful planning, and relentless focus. Every decision reflected my own priorities, not someone else's expectations. Hale's absence in my life was no longer a wound. It had become the catalyst that shaped my determination. Watching the consequences of his actions unfold, I understood the true cost of manipulation and control. The empire he had clung to, the influence he prized above all else, collapsed. What remained of his authority was hollow, and the respect he once commanded vanished quietly under scrutiny. I didn't celebrate his loss. I didn't need to. What mattered was reclaiming what had been denied to me: freedom, clarity, and dignity. Each victory, small or large, reinforced the fact that my future was finally mine alone. I could make choices without fear, without constraint, and without compromise. For the first time in years, I recognized the calm that comes with self-possession. Nights weren't spent calculating or fearing, they were spent planning next steps and enjoying moments without hidden tension. I could breathe in spaces where my presence was unchallenged and unjudged. My identity, long manipulated and undervalued, finally felt solid and secure. Hale had tried to shape me for his gain, to mold my life into a reflection of his control. 15 years later, he no longer held any influence. I had reclaimed everything that had been taken, not through anger, not through vengeance, but through steadfast patience, strategy, and perseverance. For the first time since I was 13, I felt complete. I was home in my own life, grounded in my own choices, and finally, fully free. Hey besties! Thanks for sticking with me through this journey. Imagine being abandoned at 13, surviving a house full of wealth but no warmth, and realizing years later that the person who saved you used your life for their gain. 15 years of planning, patience, and hard work finally led to reclaiming my freedom, identity, and dignity. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more.